Exhibits and Collections Curator at the Museum of Coastal Bend, and welcome to our first Lunch and Learn program. Today, we're going to hear from Emree Weaver and Bria Woods, and they're going to be talking about the photos that we have on exhibit in our current temporary exhibit, Coronavirus at the Coastal Bend. If you haven't visited the exhibit, I really recommend it. You can get to know a little bit of how your community is dealing with coronavirus. And so today we're going to be looking at some of the behind the scenes stories about taking of these photos and the subjects of the photos. What drove the photo and what the people in the photo were doing at the time and why it's significant. So again, please visit the exhibit. It's Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 4. And I'll just turn it over to these guys.
Are you guys gonna, oh, here we go. Looks like it's cropped quite a bit, actually. It's a little bit wider than that. But anyway, this is an image that one of my photographers took at a graduation ceremony, I believe Calhoun. Yeah, it looks like it says CHS there. So a lot of our coverage very early on in the pandemic, things were changing so quickly with things closing down and then eventually things opening back up that it really felt like our documentation was a visual timeline of events. And so a lot of our illustrations, one of the most important milestones that we, many people experienced during this was graduation. And that looked very different than it has, ever before, of course. And we don't normally cover area graduations. We normally just focus on Victoria schools. But, whenever some of the surrounding rural counties were allowed to actually have in-person graduations, in outdoor spaces, but, socially distanced with masks and hand sanitizer stations, we really wanted to get those visuals. And so this, I felt like, was a very illustrative image with the chairs spaced out, and everybody kind of walking super spaced out, really painting a nice picture of just how different this milestone was. So that's why I like this image and why I felt like it was very powerful in illustrating this important milestone. So.
Yes. Okay. So hello, my name is Bria Woods, and I'm super excited to be here today. And before I jump in, so all of the photos I have to share with you today are from a project that I've been working on called the Front Steps Project. And I'm just going to refer a little bit to my notes here. So the Front Steps Project was actually started by two photographers in Needham, Massachusetts, Cara Sulia and Kristen Collins. They just birthed this idea over coffee one day. And basically the principle or the foundation of this project is to photograph families standing on their front steps from a safe distance to kind of document the impact that the pandemic and social distancing and this isolation period that we've been in, the impact that that's had on families all around us. And so it started with just the families in Needham, Massachusetts, and then it blew up to photographers all over the world participating in this project. So I first started in March, just taking photos of families that I know and people that I know here in Victoria. And also, thanks to my journalism background, I decided to take a step further. And in addition to the portraits, I also have interviewed each family and individual that I've spoken with so they can share their story and use their voice to tell their truth about how this pandemic has impacted them. And so this image, this was at UHV, one of the dorms at UHV. And my friend, Christopher McDonald, he shared with me some of the challenges that he experienced living on campus as a student in the middle of a pandemic. Obviously, college campuses are designed for community and fostering relationships, but then now we're being encouraged to social distance and not to be so close with one another. And so that definitely poses some challenges. And at the time that I took this image, there were roughly 200 students that were still living on campus. Perhaps they didn't have a means of getting home right away. Their international students were in a bit of a pickle. Maybe they weren't able to get flights back to their home countries that may have already been on lockdown. So a lot of college students around America were put in a unique position almost overnight. And that's what I was trying to capture here. Obviously they're smiling and looking quite jovial, but it was a very interesting time for them. And also another fun story about this image. So back in July, the beginning of July, I was on the phone with a friend, and all of a sudden, I was getting all these notifications on Instagram, and I was like, whoa, what is going on? So when I finally opened it up, I found out that I was selected as a finalist in a photography competition with a UK-based platform called Equal Lens. And this image was selected and was given honorable mention. I was one of 7 finalists. And then a few days later, we were all published on BBC.com about this competition. So who knew that, in the midst of a pandemic, I would have the opportunity to create something that could be historically relevant, and to be recognized in that way is an honor, but also to have the opportunity to talk with, Chris and some of these students, to hear what their reality has been like has also been a gift. So, yeah.
Yeah, these shots are coming in really tight for some reason, because this image is a lot wider than this, but this approach on this one, also my staff photographer, the staff photographer that took the first image, Dewey, also took this one. He's done an incredible job with coverage during the pandemic. And in addition to some of our assignments where we'd work with reporters collaboratively on stories, a lot of my photographers were just kind of going out around town and just looking for general features. Just any kind of feature, any kind of illustration, showing how people were living during this pandemic. I mean, especially during the beginning when everything was kind of shut down, people were spending a lot of time at home, working from home. And so my photographer, Dewey, essentially just would wander around neighborhoods and see who was sitting on their front porch to get some fresh air, get out of the house, and just ask if he could take their portrait, talk to them, get some quotes from them, kind of see how they're feeling about what's going on and the world, and kind of how their story fits in all of that. So this is one of those portraits, and I like this one a lot. It's just a nice portrait, but I really like that approach of him just kind of going out, not really with much of a plan, just wandering around and taking photographs of members of our community. I mean, that's the best part of feature hunting. And so, yeah, that's what this image is.
Ooh, yay. Yeah, so these are twins, Journey and Jordan, and they are the twins of the very first family that I photographed for the Front Steps project. So Joey and Jody Sandoval, when I first moved to Victoria in 2019, they really took me under their wing since I was the new kid on the block. And so when I first decided to participate in this project, I immediately reached out to them and said, yeah, of course, come by the house. We'll pose in front of our front steps for you. And when I arrived, I noticed that the twins had written these really nice messages on their fence. And Jody and Joey were explaining to me that, they weren't quite sure how much of all the news and buzz about the virus that their children were really taking in. And it was this day that they thought okay, well, I guess they are listening. This is something that they understand. Maybe they don't understand all the big words, but this is something that is sinking in. And the takeaway, they said, stay safe and wash your hands, please. Stay safe outside, wash your hands, hope. So they understand the importance of hygiene and how that relates to the virus. And I just thought it was a really candid but endearing moment to capture them, proudly smiling in front of their PSA, for all of their neighbors. And I just think that this photo really encapsulates how all of us are kind of in the same boat of childlike innocence. We don't know what's going on really. Even scientists are all kind of scrambling to react to what this pandemic, the position that this pandemic has put us in. So in many ways, I even identify with them and their childlike innocence and not understanding what to do. But if the CDC says I need to wash my hands and sing happy birthday twice, then I'm going to do it. So, yeah.
Okay, this is actually my photo and one of my favorite images that I've taken throughout our pandemic coverage. And I think the reason for that is I think this captures one of those, what I like to call in-between moments. So a lot of what we do as photojournalists is photograph people doing things, people, in action. And some of the illustrations can be very literal translations. And so the in-between moments are the less literal translations of what's going on in someone's head or how they're feeling. And those are always my favorite moments to sort of look for. And so I photographed this family, the Kincaid family, at the very beginning of the pandemic. They were going out and drawing messages on their neighbors' driveways and sidewalks with sidewalk chalk, essentially just to share positive messages with them, Bible verses, different drawings. And I think it was maybe a week after most churches were shut down and having to do remote sermons. And so it was a Sunday and the mom was like, hey, let's go get out and, spread some Bible verses with our neighbors. And so I was photographing them doing that and wrote up a little story. And Bayless, right, who's pictured here, her son, was super energetic. He was running around on the skateboard, pushing the dog on the skateboard. I mean, had so much, just wonderful childlike energy. And I felt, he sat down in this moment and just kind of, the sun kind of peeked through these dark clouds and illuminated he and his dog there. And it's kind of like a serious, almost like inner moment that I think he's having, just, really that in-between moment. And for me, it just says so much about what he might be feeling about what's going on in the world and in that moment. And so that's why I like this image. It's a quieter image. It's not so obvious, but I think it really says a lot about what he might be feeling about the state of things. So, yeah.
Yes. Okay. So this is Chris Poncio, and he works at HEB here in town. And so actually quite recently, I reached out to my friend Jody again, because she knows a lot of people in town. And so I said, would you happen to know any essential workers, maybe that work at grocery stores or different places in town? She's like, actually, I do have a friend that works at HEB. And so he graciously agreed to let me take his portrait and be interviewed for this project. And it really mattered to me to try to speak with essential and frontline workers because, of course, there's been so many headlines about the sacrifices that they're making to show up to work every day to try to keep the world spinning while we're all in the middle of our lives being turned on their head. And so, HEB especially is like one of the crown jewels of Texas, and they even made national news. There was a Vice article written, I believe in May or June, about HEB and their swift, efficient response to the pandemic and putting up the splash guards and the stickers and, changing different policies to have a quick response to make the shopping experience, safe. And even though in his interview, Chris said that he doesn't view himself as a hero, he just shows up to work ready to tackle whatever is asked of him. But I know that to us, as consumers and shoppers, of course, we feel different about the sacrifices, the many sacrifices that essential workers are making every single day. So it was really an honor to hear his story. And he's got a big smile. He was so happy and pleasant to speak with. But yeah, I think, in our interview, one of the biggest takeaways was just remembering that, interestingly, just a few months prior to this pandemic, I think we viewed a lot of certain jobs as being, minimum wage or menial work or something you just do while you're in school. But then all of a sudden, these people became our local heroes. And I think the thing to remember is that a job is a job, and everyone's working hard to keep the world spinning, to keep this this daily thing called life working well. And so we should show the same respect and honor to everyone and every job, regardless of whether it's working at HEB or being the top executive at some company, you know? So that's something that Chris's interview and his story really reminded me of.
Another favorite image. This one was taken by one of my interns, Yehan, back, we had 2 spring interns. And I guess this was probably maybe around the end of March, at the Methodist Church downtown. This was when the 2 pastors were filming their first sermon to go on, well, I guess not live, but to, be posted on our YouTube channel for that Sunday after churches had to shut down because we couldn't gather in more than 10 people. And so this is another one of those like in between moments that I really like. So the action, they were setting up their camera and filming their sermon. But here one of the pastors was just trying on one of the masks and just sitting in the pews. And I think it really illustrates this like emptiness of the church, and church is all about community. But I think for a lot of, Christians that transcends beyond like the space itself. I think people's faith, it's not necessarily about the space that, you can have community, not necessarily in the space, but this, I think, really illustrated that sense of emptiness, which I think a lot of us have felt throughout this pandemic. So, another really important, I don't know if milestone is the right word, but just some, throughout all these things that have happened, shut down and reopened through this pandemic, churches and faith has been like a really, important part of that. So that's why I like this image. And I think it's an important part of this visual timeline, like I was talking about. So.
Yes. Okay. So this is the Perez family. They've got a very captivating story. So I'm going to really refer to my notes for this one. So Arlene here on the left-hand side and Mark here on the right, they both teach at Victoria East High School. And so the first time we spoke via Zoom, they were, sharing with me a lot of the ways that they had to quickly adjust their classrooms and transfer from in-person class to virtual class and trying to keep the students engaged and maintain the same caliber of education, and just trying to finish the spring semester as strongly as possible. And they also shared about some of the fun moments they had with their son, who he's a teenager and playing D&D. She explained a very proud moment where she rolled a nat 20. I still don't know what that is, but apparently in this game, that's very good. And then a few months later, when we spoke again, the unthinkable happened. And so I did reach out to her and she gave me permission to share this story. But Arlene and her son actually did contract the coronavirus. And so I'm just going to read a little bit. I transcribed our phone conversation. And so she shared with me they actually got it from their daughter, one of her daughters, who is a frontline healthcare worker at a facility here in Victoria. And there was an outbreak at this facility. And so that's how she ended up bringing it home. And so what's interesting is that her husband actually did not get it, even though he was in the same house with Arlene and their son. He wasn't wearing a mask and obviously probably wasn't social distancing, but he still didn't get it. And he was perfectly fine. Arlene shared with me that the symptoms, the loss of smell, they experienced some abdominal pain and gastro issues. She had crackling of the lungs as well. Her doctor did put her on some steroids and some other drugs and prescribed a breathing treatment, which ultimately helped tremendously in their recovery. And of course, a huge part of the recovery was just staying at home and quarantining for at least 2 weeks. And, she said it could have been worse than it was. Thankfully for us, we had one of the lower strain clusters, so it didn't affect us as much as some other people. And she said that unfortunately, for her daughter, she had asthma issues, so the symptoms were a little bit more exaggerated for her. And she said, thankfully, we didn't give it to any of our grandkids or any of her other children. They were very diligent about staying home the entire time. And we didn't go out, she said we didn't go out in public. And then because I also asked, because of the age difference between her teenage son and her, were his symptoms slightly different? And she said, yeah, well, he's almost 19, so his symptoms weren't as bad. And he actually said that when he had he had flu type A and B last year, and that was actually a worse experience than what he experienced with coronavirus. But for her, the symptoms were a bit worse. And interestingly, both of them kind of wrote it off as like allergy issues at first. But then once some other symptoms kicked in and she went into her doctor and got tested, and then they realized that it is in fact COVID-19. And her advice, she shared advice. She said, the best advice I can give is if you think you have it, stay away from people, wear a mask, and stay home. If you're not sure if you might have the symptoms, get it checked out. She's thankful that she stayed away from people. She said, we stayed away from the rest of our family. And because of that, we didn't give it to anybody else. So obviously, sometimes you might be a carrier and not know it, but especially if you feel funny or kind of different, she advises erring on the safe side and just getting tested or staying home. So definitely a powerful story that, of course, it would have been best if it never happened. But she was very gracious to share that and gave me permission to share that with you all as well. So yeah, that's the Perez family.
Ooh, this is a difficult moment to photograph. I did not photograph this moment. My intern Yehan took this image also at the very beginning of the pandemic. I think actually this might have been the only nursing home visit through a window that we covered. We had talked about covering some others, but I think this was right after no visitors were allowed inside nursing homes, before a lot of them started experiencing outbreaks, of course, but folks were having to visit their family members through the window. And this family, the woman hugging her granddaughter, it was the woman's mother. And so they were visiting her through the window, and I think that they were very frequent visitors of her. And so it was a very emotional experience. And I mean, part of our coverage throughout this has been, being there for difficult moments with people in the most gracious way that we can be. Of course, they invite us into those moments, which is really, we take, that with great responsibility, because it's a very heavy thing to photograph, but it's a really important story to tell and for people to see, I think. And so, what happened there? There we go. So yeah, just like in the larger narrative of things that our community members have had to face in this during this pandemic, this is one of them. And so, and like I said, my intern Yehan took this photo, and she, I think, really approaches these moments with such grace and dignity and respect for the family. But we were grateful that they wanted to open, up a very emotional experience to have us be there and to document that important moment for them. So, yeah.
Okay, those were all the photos. We're going to take some questions now. We've been collecting while you guys have been talking, so I'm just gonna throw them at you.
Okay.
As I have them. The first one is for Emree, and the question is about the graduation photo. I'm gonna go back to that.
Okay.
And the question is, did you get the feeling you mentioned that you had photographed numerous graduations. Did you get the feeling that students were not getting a sufficient sense of rite of passage due to the restrictions on graduation ceremonies and parties?
That's a tough question to answer. Also, I didn't take this photo. I myself, The types of graduation events I covered were more like senior parades and things like that. But my staff photographer, Dewey, covered a lot of the ceremonies that we covered. But I can speak from probably more of from personal experience, because my youngest sister graduated from high school this year from Goliad, which is my hometown. And my family joked with her that they felt like she and her classmates got so much more than most students get on most years. And even though it was not what everyone expected it to be, and it was much different, that it would also be really memorable for them. And they also didn't think they were going to even have a ceremony. They thought it was going to be drive-in or maybe fully remote. And so, they did so many different senior parades and Adopt a Senior. And they had were able to have an in-person ceremony, even if it was different and everyone was spaced out. And so my mom and my stepdad told her, you guys got so many more things than most students do. And so you guys were really special this year, and so much energy and attention was focused on just, trying to make the seniors feel like they could celebrate this moment. And so that's coming from a personal experience. I can't speak for how all the students felt. I know that it was very different. And for the bigger schools in Victoria, it wasn't quite the same. So I hope that students felt like they were still able to experience the rite of passage as different as it was. And I think it will be memorable, definitely, to say the least. So, yeah.
Okay, the next question is for Bria, and it's from David. And the question is, what impacted you the most in capturing these images? And what challenges did you encounter during your project?
It's a great question. So I think what impacted me most was, even I was surprised by some of the things that people were willing to share and open up with me about. I think as photographers, we're always so nervous that surely no one's going to let a stranger stick a camera in their face. And then, especially as a journalist, now I want to stick a microphone in your face and interrogate you about, some deeply intimate things about your life. But people were so willing to share deeply personal things and share their experience and their truth. And that really surprised me. And I think that was one of the biggest impacts. I think it was cathartic for both of us. For me, it was cathartic to channel all the anxiety and fear that I personally felt and still feel about the uncertainty around this pandemic into something creative and into something that I'm quite passionate about. And I think for the people that I was photographing and interviewing, it was cathartic for them to be able to say, well, you know what? This is my experience. This is my truth. This is the advice I would like to share. And so together we're able to kind of create this platform and this moment for our community to share in. And I think one of the biggest challenges, probably the logistics, obviously. So I've been photographing families both in Victoria and San Antonio, which is my hometown. And so just the logistics of going to, these different cities in Texas and photographing families and also, people are obviously allowing me to come to their home, I'm showing up in front of their house and like, okay, smile, and so, but we've created some very memorable moments, and a lot of the people that I photographed have now become friends. So I'm grateful for that.
All right, the next question is from Taylor. And the question is, has this pandemic changed your eye as a photographer in any way? And you both can answer that.
That's a really great question. I would say, sorry, do you mind if I go first? Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that, photojournalism is all about intimacy and being able to photograph people intimately, spending time with them, going inside their homes, literally photographing them from a close distance. And so when you can't do all of that, it totally changes how, you see things. And you have to really dig deep into the creativity box to figure out, how am I going to illustrate and convey intimacy while, keeping my distance, or photographing in an outdoor space, or, how do I show people living their lives when I can't go into their home? Maybe I'll shoot through a window. You just, it's definitely changed how you see things. Yeah, I mean, definitely, for sure.
Yes, yeah, I echo that 100%, because normally I don't bring my telephoto lens, if before COVID, I would just move physically closer.
Yeah.
But that telephoto lens has been getting its money's worth these past few months because, especially out of safety for the people that I'm photographing, I want to keep a distance. But also it changed the way I even thought about what is these are not the questions that I've asked and the conversations that I've had, I wouldn't have had otherwise. Now we're all under one roof, with our families or our, whoever we're living with. And, our lives have changed so drastically that we're having conversations and having moments of pause that we wouldn't have had otherwise, which has definitely changed how I think about even what is newsworthy or what is a compelling story in these past few months. So I know we're tired of hearing this phrase, but it really is a new reality, I'm grateful to have found an opportunity to kind of roll with the punches and create something out of this situation.
All right, the next question is for Emree. It's a bit of a follow-up to that one. You and your photographers are out there on the streets recording the community's response to this pandemic all day, every day. What do you think is the best summation of our capacity to handle this as a community?
Oh man, that's a tough question. It's like one of those big picture questions that I probably won't give the perfect answer to. But I've been really blown away, I think, to see the sense of community. And I think at the beginning of this pandemic, everyone was kind of a little on edge. Things were happening so quickly. We were just getting so much new information every day that it was natural that I think people were sort of on edge. And we encountered a little bit of that, people just kind of wary of us documenting and telling, the story of what was happening, which I can understand. But I think, now I think it's safe to say at this point, everybody's kind of strapped in for the long haul. We don't know how long, but, we've normalized, wearing masks and using hand sanitizer and singing happy birthday twice while you watch it. But I think really just being able to see the sense of community, really, I've seen a lot of people just doing their best to hang in there. I think offer each other love and support in the way that they know how to. And I think, what I really tried to do was balance, because this story of the pandemic, involves a lot of hard news stories, about, positive cases and deaths and people that are suffering. And that's really heavy stuff. And so I think I really wanted to balance, that coverage with some positive coverage of how community members were, living through this and supporting one another. You really do have to balance things. Otherwise, people are just going to get so overwhelmed and tune it out. And you don't want that to happen. So I've really been able to witness a lot of that through my work when I'm out in the field and also through my photographer's work. And we really have been out there a lot recording what's happening. So I hope that answers your question in some way.
All right, and the next one for Bria is Rhonda. And the question is, will you follow up with the families you photographed to see how they're doing now?
That's a great question. And actually, I guess, this conversation that I had with the Perez family was, I guess, my first follow-up. We had that conversation very recently, and, since we follow each other on social media, I'd seen that she was posting about her coping with COVID-19. So I thought maybe this could be an opportunity to kind of follow up and see how that's going, how she is now. And now that, actually, that's a very good idea. I didn't actually think about that, but that's a very good idea, because I think for each of these families, now that, for example, Journey and Jordan are back in school, so what is that reality like now? Or the students at UHV, how does virtual or in-person university work? And loads of the families that I've interviewed, there's even in just these past 4 or 5 months, things have already changed. And like you said, the situation with COVID-19 is so rapidly changing that certainly now, 4 or 5 months later, I'm sure they would all have some new updates. So that's a good idea. Thank you.
All right, I have another question for you both. Both of you photographed children. How do you see this pandemic affecting young kids? And has it changed over the course of the year?
I mean, there's no doubt that it will affect them in some
Right.
way or another, in terms of just what's going on right now with, education, and trying to figure out how to make teaching kids indoors safe again. A lot of schools are doing sort of a hybrid, I think, like remote and, in-person mixture. VISD just started back in person on Tuesday, but it's also a hybrid. Not everybody's back in person, and we covered that. And so I think that we might see some long-term effects of that. And I don't want to get too deep into that. It's, a much deeper issue, but I mean, it's hard to imagine how it will affect them, but I think that it's definitely, I mean, recently when a colleague and I interviewed Dr. Inquero, he said something about, I think that it so happens that we have about one pandemic every 100 years or something. And so, we have epidemics, throughout that time period, but I think, our last pandemic was the influenza of 1918.
Right.
So I think we were overdue for one is what he was saying essentially. Yeah. And so it's something that, you really don't experience like in a normal lifetime, I think, just with that time frame. And so for young people to, I think about my youngest sister that just graduated from high school and is going off to college and like can't experience college in a normal way. And trying to figure out how to fly out of the nest, but, it's not really fully flying from the nest. There's a lot of things that are just very different when, with coming of age stories, young teenagers or, young kids, children that are being born, during this pandemic, families that are, trying to have kids during this pandemic.
Right.
It's like, what does parenthood mean throughout all of this as well? And I mean, it's a great question. I don't know how to answer it, but I mean, I think the obvious answer is that they will be affected and changed some way.
Right.
Right.
I agree. And I know I've heard a few people compare this to what 9/11 was for us. Granted, it didn't, I mean, unless you were actually in New York or DC, which I was actually born and raised in DC, and my mom actually worked at the Pentagon. She is alive. Praise the Lord. But unless you were in those hot zones, then it didn't really affect your day-to-day life. But I guess that was the last, moment in this country that really affected everyone like on a level playing field. We all felt that moment together. And once again, like we are all feeling this pandemic together. No one is exempt from the fallout. It doesn't matter how old you are, how young you are, how much money you have. Like, we're all feeling this. But especially for children, I'm actually quite interested to see. I'm pretty sure sociologists are already, proposing, writing grants to do studies and how this will affect childhood psychology, childhood development, because especially for students who are starting school this year, their whole perception of what education is or what it can be is already vastly different from what most of us experienced. And, now they may not be able to see their friends. So how does that affect them socially? Time will tell. But I think this will definitely, in the next 18 to 20 years, be some very fascinating studies to read, to find out how the pandemic affected their growth and their development.
Okay, we have a question for Bria. You touched a little bit on HEB workers as superheroes. And so the question is, how will our experiences this year change our view of all kinds of workers moving forward?
Great question. I think one of the most impactful ways that this pandemic has even shifted my perspective of essential workers is even just recognizing that they are essential, and that without people not only in customer facing positions, but even in the warehouses or in the logistics arena, like healthcare workers, they're all playing such a crucial role, and we shouldn't look down on anyone or any position. People are working incredibly hard right now to not only meet the increased demands that this pandemic is requiring of our communities, but also we have fewer resources. We're trying to do more with less. And so I'm really quite humbled and grateful for everyone who is putting not only themselves on the line, but even their families. I think we have to remember that every healthcare worker that's going out, or even people in the grocery stores, people that work at like plumbing or like AAA or, those places that can't just close, simply because we're in a pandemic. Like, just take a moment to really express your gratitude. And I think respect is the biggest thing we have to remember. And this is another thing I spoke about with Chris. The faces that you see at these businesses, they didn't write the executive order. They are not just wear your mask and just cooperate. You know what I mean? It is not his fault. Please don't take it out on the people who are just trying just as hard as you are to make it through each day. Let's just cooperate and show kindness and appreciation for each other. We're all working hard, community and essential workers. So I think that's one of the biggest takeaways regarding essential workers that I've learned and that I've come to appreciate during this time.
Right, and one last question, I think, for Emree, and then I'm going to give you both a chance to sort of sum up and say here. But your question here is, in your being out with me, and sort of on pipelines all the time, taking this, were there any points at which you felt that your documentation of the pandemic was placing you in danger? And how did you cope with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I guess I'll give a couple of, tell a couple of short stories about that, just that I think are illustrative of how I felt with my safety. At this point, I've covered a lot of testing sites, which is crazy to think about, and how like normalized it's become for me to just like, oh, we have another testing site. But the first one I covered was at the way station outside of Goliad, and it was a drive-through testing site where you had to have a referral from a doctor. It wasn't walk up. You had, you couldn't just come up to it. And that gave me like a really eerie feeling. I don't know that I felt unsafe. It was in an outdoor space, but it gave me this like very eerie feeling of, covering this space, that these were probably people coming through that I might know from my hometown and grew up around, and that was more towards the beginning of the pandemic. And so, I mean, I guess I say that as an example of that is a space where, there's, people coming through might have the, COVID. And I've covered other testing sites where people coming through also could have it. And so I've been in a couple of hospitals as well, not in any COVID units. Access to COVID units has been very difficult to get for us, but, understandably so. But I have been in spaces that have been higher risk. And I think, I don't know that I was ever incredibly worried that that I would not be okay, that, I would always wear my mask, of course, like we had been wearing masks, I think, before it was even a mandate, just because that was it was a recommendation from the CDC before it was a mandate. I tried very quickly. It was hard to find like a cohesive set of guidelines for photojournalists to follow in the field, which, and I'm a member of NPPA, which is, a press photographers organization, and a lot of other folks were sort of just sharing their experience of safety precautions that they were taking. And so, I tried, asked the advocate if they could give us some hand sanitizer and, masks and, personal protective equipment, things like that could keep us safe while we were out in the field, because photographers don't really have an option to not go into the field. We can't take photos on the phone. So I think we just tried our best to follow the guidelines that I was learning from my colleagues elsewhere in the country, working for other newspapers as best as possible, and being as safe as we could, and also protecting the people that we were photographing, because we were out a lot, and if they were not, that they were, maybe experiencing a risk by letting us come take their photos. So, no, I don't think I was ever incredibly worried. I think I just always, made sure that I took the safety precautions. So, yeah, I don't know if your experience was similar.
Yes, yeah. Well, in terms of work, I'm actually still working from home. But with this project, I definitely felt comfortable taking photos from a distance. And then thank God for Zoom. Zoom has really saved the day this year. And, being able to conduct the interviews via Zoom, I think provided peace of mind for both of us. And thankfully we live in such a digital age, because like with the last pandemic, I don't know. I mean, I guess do they just write letters to each other or yell out of their windows or something? So I'm grateful that we have technology that can help bridge that physical gap, and help us to still feel a sense of community and like togetherness, even though, we need to stay apart for right now physically.
Okay, we've got one last question from Bria, from Wanda. And the question is, how do you think the Your Front Steps project will affect people in the future as they look back on your project historically?
Wow, lots of great questions. Well, actually, first of all, it's even just the exhibit, my photos being in this exhibit here at the Museum of the Coastal Bend, it was confirmation, the first confirmation that I had that, okay, well, maybe I have created something historically relevant here. And what started out as, like I said, is just a way for me to kind of channel my energy and create, engage in something creative, really turned into an opportunity to not only share stories, but again, to create something historically relevant. And so I'm hoping that through people coming to see this exhibition and seeing our photos, that they'll be reminded that this is living history. We are living through something that, our children and our children's children will be reading about in history books. And so this is the time to share your story, document your experience. Who knows? Your story may end up in the Smithsonian somewhere. We need to create those artifacts that future generations can look back on. We take for granted that things are so heavily documented right now, but don't forget your story as well. That's important, not just for you and your family, but for your community and beyond, to see what was the impact, what was the effect, and what can we learn from this, so that in another 100 years, if there's another pandemic, then maybe we can learn from what happened this time to be more prepared. So I'm grateful, so grateful to have had the opportunity to create something like this, and grateful to Cara Sulia and Kristen Collins, who created the Front Steps Project, and to all the families who I've interviewed who so graciously shared their story and their truth with me. I couldn't have done it without everyone, so thank you.
Right. This is for both of you. Do you want to, some other thoughts on this project, and maybe tell us a little bit about what you hope visitors will take away from the exhibit?
I can start out if you want. I think I tried to touch on this, for our virtual reception, not very eloquently, but, I see my role as a photojournalist, especially in a small community and doing community journalism rather than big, working for a big national outlet, is, trying to help neighbors feel more connected to one another. And if, one person sees the story of someone else that they maybe wouldn't have otherwise understood. And photography is very emotive. And so it really, I think, pulls people into people's stories. It's very personal. And so I think that's how I see my job, even just under normal circumstances. But I think that I feel that way about this exhibit as well, is, I want, community members to be able to understand their fellow community members and neighbors maybe a little bit better, and see that maybe their stories are similar in some ways. I know that there's a spectrum of the ways in which people are experiencing this pandemic, but like you said, no one is immune from it. Everyone has felt it in some way, even if it's just feelings of isolation and loneliness from not being able to socialize in the way that we're used to. And so I think that maybe that might help people feel a stronger sense of community and feel less alone in this collective crisis we're all facing, if they see, themselves reflected in the stories of other people, and it helps them, maybe understand their neighbors a little bit better. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that for me, my hope is that people would take away a reminder that there are real faces and names behind those who are being impacted by this virus, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, when there were so many headlines talking in big numbers, hundreds of this, thousands of this, and there's nothing personal about that. Or, when the employment rates came out, this many people unemployed, but who are they? They live next door to you. You passed them in the grocery store yesterday. They might have babysat your kids a few weeks ago. Like, there are real names and faces. And that's what I think the Front Steps Project seeks to do. And that's definitely what I sought to do. And I think what photographers seek to do is to put a face and a name, to pull out someone from the crowd and just instill a bit of humanity back into these stories and into this moment. And like you said, so you can find yourself, I've had many people message me and say like, wow, my aunt, is a healthcare worker, or, my dad works at HEB as well, or, I can relate to this, or I can relate to that. And so that means a lot to know that people don't have to, you're not alone. It doesn't make the virus go away, unfortunately, but we're not alone. And so I hope that this exhibit will remind you that, to just take a moment to really look at your neighbors in the eye and acknowledge their humanity, and to remember that you're not alone. And that, in fact, together is how we will make it to the other side of this pandemic. Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank both of you guys personally for your immense contribution to my little exhibit idea. And our viewers have actually also expressed their thanks to you both for a wonderful panel. We also need to take this opportunity to thank our IT people who have made this an amazing opportunity for us all. And I hope that our viewers will tune in next month for another Lunch and Learn. And that time we will be talking a little bit about archaeology. Thanks everybody for showing up.